Welcome, everybody. I'm Brass from Tri-Media
Again,
Innovations.
I'm Brother Mujasi, family science practitioner by trade, but I'm a practicing historian just because we get to unearth some of the architectures behind our struggle and our tradition. Brother Brown.
What we're going to do now is take a specific look at the hidden architects of 1910 to 1930 and the ideas that helped shape the world around us as Americans, but also as Black Americans too. The world that we live in today didn't appear overnight. It was built, shaped, and challenged and transformed by generations of people whose names are often forgotten, whose contributions are often overlooked, and whose stories are rarely told in full, which is key, yet their fingerprints remain all around us. Tonight, we're going to shine a light on the stories that deserve to be remembered. We're exploring the people, the movements, the ideas that helped create the world that we inherited. But before we get into the portion of the show that highlights the architects, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the world that we actually inherited at that time. You got to picture the world from 1910 to 1930 to understand this show. The world that the leaders that we're talking about from all walks of life inherited, by 1910, you got the Great Migration. Now, the Great Migration is millions of Black Americans who were living under Jim Crow segregation and racial violence, political economic opportunity. Many had spent generations in the South, but now for the first time, large numbers were beginning to leave. Cities like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, so on and so forth, they offered something many people had never had before, and it's a key word, it's called possibility. The Great Migration will become one of the largest population movements in American history, and it will reshape Black America forever. But just as this migration was beginning to gain momentum, another event would shake the entire world. And that would be in 1914, when Europe erupted into war. Eventually, America would be pulled into this conflict as well. And 1 second.
Okay, good. I'm like,
So now, welcome to Hidden Architects in Black History from 1910 to 1930. That's a key period in the history of our people. It's a key period in the history of America. The world that we live in today, it didn't appear overnight. It was built, shaped, challenged, and transformed by generations of people whose names are often forgotten, whose contributions are often overlooked, and whose stories are rarely told in full. In the neighborhoods we live in, the institutions that we depend on, in the opportunities that we pursue, and in the challenges that we continue to face, we're going to shine a light on the stories that deserve to be remembered. And understand what we mean by deserve. It deserves to be remembered. Rome wasn't built in a day, neither was the Black community. But we got to talk about the world that we inherited first. I don't want to already be talking about the leaders as if they had a blank canvas. The world that they inherited, if you're talking about 1910, you're talking about the Great Migration. By 1910, millions of Black Americans, just picture, they were living under Jim Crow, segregation, racial violence, political disenfranchisement, and a lot of limited economic opportunity. And many of those people had spent generations in the South. So for the first time now, large numbers are beginning to leave to northern cities, Midwestern cities, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, even New York, because it offered them something that they didn't have before, which is possibility. The Great Migration will become one of the largest population movements in American history, and it will reshape Black America forever. Now, just as this migration was beginning to gain momentum, another event would shake the world. In 1914, Europe erupted into war, and eventually America would be pulled into that conflict as well. So from 1914 to 1918, you get World War I. That's 350,000 Black Americans serving in uniform during World War I, fighting bravely overseas, and they experienced something unexpected in parts of Europe. They were treated with a degree of respect that they were rarely treated with at home. When those soldiers returned to America, they returned with a question in their minds. Mind you, we're talking about the world that they inherited. If we can fight for democracy abroad, why can't we enjoy democracy at home? And that question would shape the leaders that we're going to talk, the next generation of Black leadership. Because while they were fighting overseas for freedom, justice, and equality, there was a whole nother battle being fought here in America. And it didn't have any guns in it. It didn't have any images. It had their images. It had a whole nother story, and it had a whole nother culture. And that one film would influence American race relations for decades. Yes, I'm talking about 1915, Birth of a Nation. It was one of the first blockbuster movies in American history. Millions of Americans saw it. And that film portrayed Black people as dangerous and capable of self-government. And at the same time, it portrayed the Ku Klux Klan as heroes. That influence spread far beyond movie theaters and helped reinforce racial stereotypes for an entire generation, I think, even leading up until today in 2026. Now, see, movies, they don't just simply reflect culture. Sometimes they help create it. And the ideas celebrated in Birth of a Nation helped fuel the rebirth of one of the most notorious organizations in American history. That's right, folks, I'm talking about the second rise of the KKK. The Ku Klux Klan returned with enormous force. This wasn't simply a Southern thing anymore. The Klan spread into Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Colorado, Oregon, and dozens of other states. At its height, millions of Americans joined, and the people we're discussing tonight, they weren't fighting a fringe movement anymore. At this point, now they're confronting an organization with political influence, social power, and national reach. But history is rarely one story. While hatred was growing in one part of America, creativity was exploding in another. It's the beauty of America. It's the beauty of being alive. The same migration that moved people north also brought together writers, artists, musicians, thinkers, and yes, activists. And no more and nowhere was that more visible than Harlem.
And Harlem wasn't just a visibility of these new artisans and these new literary writers. They were activists. They were radicalists. They understood the plight of the Negro of that time, and they wanted to transcend our current social circumstances to be able to challenge that in a new way. The cultural movement that we now know as the Harlem Renaissance reshaped Black artistic identity. I mean, we're talking about a class of Black folk that came of age and not had any ties to slavery as a participant. Their parents were, their grandparents were, but this was a new class of identity as Blacks or as Negroes who was trying to reshape what they understood with the world that they inherited. Harlem's Black population grew from 50,000 in 1914 to over 200,000 by the mid 1920s. And so this is how you got influential figures like a Langston Hughes or a Zora Neale Hurston. But one of the most key important figures that I have to elevate in this hidden architecture is someone by the name of Claude McKay, which we're going to get into a little bit later. The movement produced literature. It expanded and emphasized jazz and the jazz culture. And it created political thought emphasizing racial pride and cultural self-definition. And so it's important to understand this creative radicalization that came out of Harlem, but this was also covering a large portion of Black identity politics across the North as well. And so another thing to highlight with the that this time that this group of people that we're going to talk about they inherited is also understanding racial violence. Tulsa was one that was a part of an extension of racialization, racialized violence, and what they white folks will call the cleansing process that came about in this era. But one of the most significant years where Black folks experienced and had to either flee or fight for their survival is what historians now term the Red Summer. During 1919, in the in the hot smoldering of the summer across the nation, more than 25 race riots occurred across American cities. And some of the major incidents happened in Chicago, where you had just under 40 people died in this experience. Black folks died in this experience. Over 500 people were injured, and 1,000 Black home residents was destroyed, either burnt or blown up. This happened in Washington, D.C. Another space that doesn't always get elevated, but is just as known as the Tulsa incident, is what happened in Elaine, Arkansas, which is now coined as the Elaine Massacre, where hundreds of Black sharecroppers who was organizing were for equal wages in the fair cotton prices because their bales of hay was not being equally purchased and participated with other white landowners. They were murdered and killed in Elaine, Arkansas, just for organizing for their political rights and their economic rights. And this was hallmark for that summer. And some of the causes of this was because of the housing competition that was happening in northern cities and across the nation as a whole. Then you had, right, like Brass was talking about earlier with the veterans coming home from World War I, you had white resentment towards these Black war veterans that said, if I'm going to fight for democracy abroad, I'm going to have to fight for democracy and my inclusion here in the States. And that created this resentment, or what we call the white backlash, because Black folks began to militarize themselves and politicize themselves to fight for equal rights. And then you had labor tensions. Of course, World War I brought about this significant amount of tension between workers and the corporate owners and factories. And of course, and Black folks got caught oftentimes in the middle and became the recipients of white violence and white hatred towards our experience in the labor force. So this violence catalyzed new Black political organizing and self-defense movements. And you can see this come about in what we now call the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porter. In 1925, you had Black Pullman workers who worked for the Pullman Company who began to say, we are not being paid equal wages. We're being worked oftentimes for days straight, not seeing our families at all. You had workers who was on the Pullman corridor who was being degraded and discriminated upon on the day, degraded and insulted because of their existence, called Georges throughout their whole existence of working in that company. And they decided to say, you know what, we have to create some type of union block that would allow us to be able to advocate for not only equal wages, but safer work conditions, to be able to have better opportunities, to be able to have a relationship between our work and life balance. And so they organized a union outside of the Pullman Company and found a representative in someone called Asa Philip Randolph, who represented the bigger picture of the union and began to advocate for the Pullman workers' rights. So this is what we experienced in the 1910s, the 1930s, and the 1920s. And it was the significance of this era where we began to see how we were impacted by this entire process of what these architectures and experience. And one last thing I wanted to highlight was basically, for the most part, what the Great Depression did for Black folks. Black workers were hit first and hit hardest during the Great Depression. When the economy collapsed and after the stock market crashed in 1929, Black workers often was the first fired and the last to be hired. And because many Black workers occupied the lowest paying and least secure jobs, they had little protection during that layoff, which is why we began to organize unions. And in some of these northern cities, Black unemployment reached almost between 40 to 60%, compared to roughly about 25% nationally of the worst point in the Depression. And so we oftentimes, you heard that saying, when America gets a cold, Black folks get the flu. And so while some of our workers sometimes demanded that the employers remove Black workers um, that from jobs entirely, we never had a job security in that process. And so some of the common political phrases that came around the Great Depression was that no jobs for the Negroes until every white man has a job. And so this is the context that we're setting the stage for, because as we begin to unfold and unravel some of these hidden characters that some of you may know of, some of you may not, put them in the context of what was going on across the nation at that time. Let's move on. Oh, okay. So I'm going to start with Robert Abbott. And if some of you have heard of him and some of you may not, most of you experienced him, or at least your grandparents and great grandparents have, and your parents have, when it comes to the Defender, Chicago Defender, which was one of the most significant media processes that we've had that came out of our community. Robert um, Robert Abbott was born in St. Simmons Island in Georgia in 1870. He died in 1870s, 5 years after the Civil War during the Reconstruction era. His mother, Flora Abbott, was a formerly enslaved woman, because his father, Thomas Abbott, died when he was a baby, so he never got to experience his full father. But his mother remarried to a guy named John Sengstacke, which is where Robert got his middle name from. And John Sengstacke was the person who really opened up the stage for him. He was a mixed person, a mixed heritage, German-born missionary and congregationist, but John's mother was an African woman who married this German guy. Through John, Robert Abbott learned the importance of education, disciplining himself, his religious leadership, and he was exposed through John to printing and the literary culture. And it's important to understand this piece because, again, we're emphasizing and highlighting this father-son connection, that it allowed him to have a framework that would set him up to build one of the most influential institutions later on. Robert Abbott was educated at Hampton Institute, Hampton Normal School at the time, which was established by Samuel Chapman Armstrong, which was the model school that influenced Tuskegee Institute. He graduated there and moved on to Kent College of Law. Now, this is one of the things that we very little people notice about Robert Abbott, that he had a law degree, that he graduated in 1899 from Kent College of Law, and was able to establish himself as a lawyer. But because of that time, white clients was not going to hire a Black lawyer to represent them in court, nor did Black clients at the time have the resources to be able to support him legal and to support his legal practice. And so this frustrating kind of position that he found himself in as an unemployed lawyer pushed Abbott towards journalism as a political tool. And so by 1905, he will embark upon one of the most profound institutional building processes of that time. He started the Chicago Defender with 25 cents of capital. He initially printed his first copies in his landlord's kitchen. And it was one of those grassroots movements that he said he had a vision. He was going to establish this process and begin work. And he wrote all the articles himself on those first editions, printed copies himself, and distributed the papers like we would do today at the back of your trunk. And some of the earliest issues emphasized local news, civil rights advocacy, political commentary. But the goal with the paper was to challenge racial injustice nationally. And so this became kind of like an innovative journalism and media strategy. He used aggressive and modern newspaper techniques that's uncommon at the time, like using sensational headlines, bold typography, emotionally charged language. One of the key things that he did that often papers that were done by Black press didn't do was detail the coverage of lynchings and racial violence at that time, which was significant because that process of creating the imagery within what was happening to our brothers and sisters across the nation during this hyper-racialized time was not being covered in specific specificity and details. And he covered it to help politicize a new group of people. The paper openly promoted civil rights, migration process, and Black economic power. So one of the key things that we can pull out of this as I close on Robert is that His role in the Great Migration from 1915 to 1930 was significant with the Chicago Defender. He played a major role in encouraging Southern Black migrants north during the Great Depression and helping them to understand where the economic opportunities was. Okay, by 1917, the newspaper published articles encouraging Southern Blacks to relocate to northern cities, Midwestern cities. It advertised job advertisement, train schedules, housing opportunities, and making sure that folks was informed on the process if they were going to make that journey. Now, key thing in mind, many counties and states in the South barred the Chicago Defender from being able to be published and distributed. Get that. And so the mechanisms of working with some of the laborers and some of the Pullman porters and people on the railroad track created literary hubs and smuggling the Chicago Defender in counties in the South that Black folks wouldn't be able to purchase it at their local stores. And that's a powerful key piece. I'll close with this. The national distribution network of this process became huge. And we have to understand that the mechanism that Black folks used to be our grapevine was one of the key ways that we was able to inform each other, support each other in our migration process, and keep everybody politicized on what was going on in the context of our experience. And we'll move forward from there.
I'm going to transition immediately from Brother Abbott. Now, if you want to look at this as a transition, look at it just like this. Abbott helped people move, but the next hidden architect, he helped people fight. While Abbott was building one of the most influential newspapers in America, William Monroe Trotter was becoming one of the most uncompromising voices for Black citizenship in the country. Now, William Monroe Trotter, he was born in Chillicothe, Ohio. He later moved to Massachusetts. He's a graduate of Harvard University, but I don't really want to get into all of that. Those are things you can look up in Wikipedia. He was fearless. He was one of the most fearless civil rights activists of this generation, and most people have never even heard his name. But if you've ever heard somebody argue that Black Americans should demand equality now rather than wait for it later, you've heard an argument that Trotter was making a century ago, and that's key. The key time period in 1910 to 1930 is this is not a time where they were trying to hear Black voices. The people that we're bringing up, they fought through all of the issues. They fought through all of the anger, and they still made sure that their voices were heard. Now, what did he build? He built the Boston Guardian. Now, this is 1901. It wasn't just a newspaper. It was a weapon. At a time when newspapers ignored injustice, he used the Guardian to attack segregation, expose discrimination, challenge both white political leaders and Black leaders that he believed were quote unquote compromising too much. His most important contribution, though, may have been helping create the Niagara movement in 1905. The Niagara movement was founded near Niagara Falls because many hotels on the American side refused Black guests. That's a tidbit you could take with you. This organization demanded voting rights, equal education, equal treatment under the law, and an end to segregation. And in many ways, the Niagara movement, to bring it forward, is almost a direct predecessor to the NAACP. Without the Niagara movement, there may never have been an NAACP. Now, why does this matter? Because Trotter lived during a time where one side argued that Black Americans should focus on economic progress and wait for civil rights. Trotter rejected that idea completely. He believed rights delayed were rights denied. He believed that citizenship was not something Black Americans should negotiate for. It was something that they already deserved. One story that'll tell you everything about Trotter happened in 1914 with President Woodrow Wilson. He had begun segregating parts of the federal government. Most people would never have challenged the president directly, but Trotter did. He confronted Wilson inside the White House itself. That meeting was heated, but it showed the kind of man Trotter was. He wasn't interested in comfort. He was interested in justice. Now, the reason why we say these are hidden architects, because during this time, remember, we're talking about 1901. So the people that you would have been more credited with would be W.E.B. Du Bois, sometimes Booker T. Washington, sometimes even the NAACP itself. But Trotter was one of the earliest voices demanding immediate equality. One of his most powerful quotes was, "The colored American is entitled to every right enjoyed by every other American." Some people make history and others make history possible. Now, before I pass this back to my brother Mujasi, I'm going to say a quick question just for you to think about. If Trotter's approach had won the racial debate earlier, we're talking about in the early 1900s, would civil rights have unfolded differently? I always like to leave people with a question. I'm going to send this back into my brother Mujasi.
See, that man, being able to understand William Monroe Trotter and the significance of how these key people played an impactful piece is how we understand the deeper details of the long struggle and the long tradition and the long movement of Black progress. And that's one person that I want to bring up that we mentioned earlier that I said we're going to come back to, and that's Claude McKay, because he's another. Now, most of the times, let me look at my notes because there's certain people that we oftentimes count in the Harlem Renaissance era, but we don't always highlight some of those significant other ones like William Trotter. We know about Zora Neale Hurston and her anthropology and anthropological positionings, her writings, her research, and her stories. We know about Langston Hughes, who was, you can't even say Harlem Renaissance without saying Langston Hughes and some of his writings and how he was viscerally able to get into the details of the Negro life and artistically talk about racism in such a way and declare our cultural politics. And if you know about Hubert Harrison and many others who were significant in shaping the political framework of how we understood our art to our politics, Claude McKay would be one of those. This brother was born in Clarendon Parish, Jamaica in 1889. And if you understand Jamaica at the time, it was built largely of a lot of workers and after it was emancipated in 1838. But there were some of Black folks in Jamaica who were descendants, African descendants, who had land holding in that space. And Claude comes from a family that was a land holding group of people. In that kind of context, he will be considered middle class. And so his family had the ability to afford to own small agricultural plots, which gave them a modest independency. At the time, his brother, I think his brother name was Uriah Theodore, he became a school teacher, which helped to strongly influence Claude in exposing him to early stuff is like the Jamaican folklore culture, African derived oral traditions, and local dialectical poetry. And in that space, you get this early foundation of Claude being able to use the pen and his literary understanding to shape his views. His early education was kind of largely based on his connection with his brother, but he was exposed to English literature, political philosophy, British romantic poetry. His most influential mentor at the time was Walter Jackal, a British expatriate living in Jamaica at the time. And Jackal is the one who encouraged McKay to write poetry in the Jamaican patois dialect, which was a radical at the time because most folks under the British colony was trying to anglicize their writing, their literature, their worldview. And he was encouraged to use this African dialect of English to be able to write some of his best influential writings. And so you see early influences including like William Wordsmouth, I think that's his name, Wordsworth, Percy Shelley, and a lot of those early traditions, early writers who influenced some of his work. His first publication was Songs of Jamaica and Castaba Ballads, which at the time was an innovative piece because he wrote it in the dialogue, but really dug into Jamaican life and the Jamaican Creole dialect and talked about the peasant life, colonial authority, and Black dignity, which was elevating in some of his writing. When he migrated to the United States in 1912, he came on a scholarship from Jamaica, which initially to study agriculture in Tuskegee Institute. He got involved with it and had some influence by Booker T. Washington, but he began to dislike the military discipline of Tuskegee. He liked the industrial education model, but he eventually realized that the agricultural piece wasn't for him. So he transferred to Kansas State Agricultural College, but eventually he soon abandoned agriculture as his study to pursue writing and political engagement. And so here's the piece where it becomes significant. He became radicalized and moved to like this socialistic point of view once he moved into these positions in America and in the North. He began to contribute to the Liberator, which was a socialist magazine within the Socialist Party. And he began to work with radical editors like Max Eastman, who was a part of the Socialist Party at the time, and became associated with some of the Black radical labor activists like C.L.R. James and a few others like that. He worked briefly as a railroad porter and a waiter, which exposed him to some of the class conditions and some of the kind of working positions that Black folks experienced at that time. But he eventually became situated in the Socialist Party of America, and some of his political thoughts blended with anti-colonization, Black nationalism, and the socialist rhetoric at the time. Now, it was during the red hot summer that he produced one of his best infamous works out of that experience, If We Must Die. And in that poem, I can't remember some of the quotes in there, but that poem became one of the most political cries for Black folks when they decided to defend themselves versus just taking the racialized violence and experience that they was going through. And he basically said, if we must die, let it not be like hogs. That we, for the most part, we're going to die on our feet, and we're going to die fighting, and we're going to die at least fighting for our dignity. And so the powerful piece of looking at Claude McKay and his work became kind of like a central piece of how the politicalization of Harlemites, Black Harlemites, began to really challenge racism and white supremacy at the time. And you have to put him next to some of the leaders like Langston Hughes and Count Collin and Zora Neale Hurston, because it's McKay in that grounding that was able to move the cultural literacy of Black writing into that political piece and bring some of these bigger frameworks like socialism and communistic thought to Black life. And a lot of us, sometimes people think that once we were kind of moved into the Republican Party and began to be courted by the Democratic Party, that we just stayed bouncing between those two polarities. But Claude McKay in his writings gives us an examples of how Black folks was always considering political ideas and frameworks if it meant that we can see some strategies to our liberation and freedom at that time. And so I'm gonna close with this. Some of his major literary works, Home to Harlem, Banjo, Banana Bottom, all of these pieces became critical components of how Harlem intellectuals like Du Bois, Harrison, and how they understood the working class position. And some of them criticized McKay because of his visceral understanding of the working class position in his socialist background. But it carved out one of the most important frameworks and understand that we needed in order to understand where the Black folks who was not a part of that talented 10th or that elitist group, what was their visceral experience, and how do we find the language to be able to argue and fight for our political inclusion?
Trimedia Records.
What is that? We are fucking back. What is that? Fuck, I'm feeling good. What's it?
Check.
It's a fucking killer.
It's that motion when I flow this shit. Nigga just so legit. You damn boy if you sliding. How many hoes you get? Me? They be on my dick smelling like the coldest scene. Looking good, that wood filled with the animal clover mix. When I pop that shit, it's the oldest trick. Literal coldest sin. Baby, text me since you got a bone up pick. I'ma pull up on the bitch. Holy shit. Notice the golden bonus that's on this wrist. On the trip, with no chill. Bitch with a police beat. But back to the session at hand. There go that man.
Now, in these conversations, and amazing job, Brother Majasi, but in some people, they make history. Others make history possible. Nannie Helen Burroughs is one of my favorite hidden architects. Now, the reason why I say that is because Claude McKay, he used words to challenge America, but she used education. And I come from a long line of educators. My family used the education system to pay our bills when we were kids. And I use it today in the same token. So while McKay was helping define the Harlem Renaissance, Nannie Helen Burroughs was building something even more permanent: institutions. Now, Nannie Helen Burroughs, she was born in Orange, Virginia. If William Monroe Trotter fought in the public square, Burroughs fought in the classroom, right? And in many ways, her battlefield may have been just as important because Burroughs understood something simple. If you can educate a generation, you can change a nation. So what did she build? In 1909, Burroughs founded the National Training School for Women and Girls in Washington, D.C. Now, don't let the word school fool you. This wasn't simply a place where students sat in desks and memorized facts. Burroughs was trying to create leaders. Women learned business skills, teaching skills, public speaking, leadership, amongst many other things. But one of the keys was economic independence. She wanted Black women prepared not only to survive, but to lead. And think of it this way. Booker T. Washington built Tuskegee. Burroughs built something similar, but it was for Black women. Now, why did this matter? Because Black women were being challenged from multiple directions. They faced racism, they faced sexism, they faced economic barriers. Burroughs believed education was the key that unlocked every other door. One of the things that I was always taught was that the Black woman, because she's a woman in the United States, of a patriarchal United States, and she's also an African American in these United States. And then you're picturing this time, 1910 to 1930, it's particularly rough. It's uniquely rough for the women in Black America. She wasn't simply teaching subjects in these schools. She was simply building confidence, leadership, and building institutions, but key institution builders. And one thing other people don't know about her, she became a major voice inside the National Baptist Convention. Through the church, she reached thousands of people. Through her speeches, she constantly emphasized education, faith, discipline, and self-reliance. She wasn't waiting for society to create opportunities. She was teaching people how to create their own. One of her most famous speeches was called How the Sisters Are Hindered from Helping. I'm going to say that again. How the sisters are hindered from helping. In that speech, she challenged the barriers preventing Black women from contributing fully to society. What makes the speech remarkable is that it still sounds modern today. Many of the issues that she identified are conversations we're still having more than a century later. Now, who gets more credit? Mind you, we're talking about hidden architects. These are people that you may not have heard of because they've been highlighted and sometimes downplayed. Now, who gets more credit today? You will know this name, Mary McLeod Bethune. Sometimes Booker T. Washington. Sometimes even people who came decades later. Yet Burroughs spent over 50 years building institutions that impacted thousands of lives. I go to a quote. We specialize in the wholly impossible. And when you look at what she accomplished, it's hard to argue with her. They planted the seeds that we are still growing from. That's why this show is so important and why she matters. Movements don't survive without educated people. Once again, movements do not survive without educated people. Leaders don't appear out of thin air. Somebody has to teach them. Somebody has to prepare them. Somebody has to believe in them before the world does. Education gives you that strength, that confidence to get out into a world that doesn't believe in you, a world that's not prepared for you, but you can take that education and you can fight and level the playing. Nannie Helen Burroughs spent her life doing exactly that. My closing question would be, what creates more lasting change? Winning an argument or educating a generation? I pass it back to my brother Mujasa.
Man, that was phenomenal, champ. That you can't spell that out any better, especially when you talk about how education creates the opportunities for us in establishing institutions. And that is the hallmark of what we see with this next person that we're going to pull up, this next hidden architecture, Maggie Lena Walker, who was, I would say, she's up there with those institution builders and how she understood the importance of creating economic models at an institution. Miss Walker was born in Richmond, Virginia. One of my brothers who's on the Discord is from Richmond during the final year of the Civil War. Her mother, Elizabeth, was a formerly enslaved woman who worked as a laundress and a domestic worker for white families. Her stepfather, William Mitchell, which is a butler, he was a butler in the household of abolitionists. Um, he was also in the household of a abolitionist who may have been considered a Union spy. But she grew up in post-Reconstruction Richmond, a city with one of the largest Black populations before the Civil War. And her household operated as a home base to laundry business, exposing Walker to early concepts of customer networks, bookkeeping practices, and informal Black economic cooperation. And this became the hallmark of her economic stay when her father, stepfather William Mitchell, died under basically, for the most part, lynched in 1876. And so, as a background, her education in Richmond was at the Richmond Colored Public Schools at the time, which was established after the Civil War. And she attended that school and for the most part got her teacher training and institution as a Black educator. So she moved into the space of being able to create education for Black folks, which was the avenue and key liberation movement in the late 19th century. And while she was a student, a teenager, she joined the Independent Order of St. Luke, which is a Black mutual aid society. We'll come back to them in a quick second. She graduated in 1883 and became a teacher in the Richmond public schools. And at the time, Richmond required female teachers to resign upon marriage. As soon as there was marriage, they could not work in the school systems and really work in larger systems anymore. And that was a common practice at that time. She resigned from teaching after marrying her husband, Armstead Walker Jr. in 1886. Her training didn't stop. Her training in pedagogy influenced her later in public speaking style, her leadership training and organized management and Black fraternal organizations. So I said that as a teenager, she joined the Order of St. Luke. What is the order, the Independent Order of St. Luke? It was a Black mutual aid fraternity society founded in 1866 in Baltimore. And its mission included burial insurance, sickness benefits, economic mutual aid, and racial uplift. And Walker, as a young lady, she joined the Richmond branch as a teenager and quickly rose up, becoming one of the strongest leaders as a young person moving into adulthood to be able to influence this organization. By 1890, the organization was kind of nearly bankrupt and it was shrinking in membership. And Walker became kind of like the secretary. I think she was like the right worthy grand secretary of the national organization. But from her, membership at the time was only at 1,200, I think about 1,200 people. She reorganized this organization and reorganized and implemented due enforcements. She strengthened local councils, creating youth training divisions. And within a decade, membership expanded to over 100,000. It went from 1,200 members nationally to 100,000 members across multiple states. And so in that process of organizing the Independent Order of St. Luke, she created the St. Luke Herald in 1982. She founded this as a kind of like an official newspaper for the order. And the paper functioned as an organizational bulletin, a Black economic development platform, and a political awareness forum. Now, remember, we talked about Robert Allen earlier, understanding the power and the importance of media. Ms. Walker will understand this same dynamic in terms of creating something that's influential to be able to get information and to encourage economic development amongst our people. The circulation spread across Black communities in the Mid-Atlantic and the South and the Southern regions. A lot of the articles promoted the saving kind of practices and the culture of savings, cooperative economics, business ownership, and a lot of racial pride pieces. But Walker frequently wrote editorials encouraging Black communities to keep their money within their communities. What does that mean at that time? It means that Black economics will thrive and be able to build more sustainable institutions, family health, and progressive processes in our education if we keep their money within our own communities, quote unquote. So this newspaper also served as a kind of like an infrastructure for the St. Luke network. But along with that, she wanted to encourage not just the periodical piece, but how do we galvanize our economic situations into one central location? So in 1903, she established the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank. And so this St. Luke Penny Savings Bank in Richmond, she became the first Black woman in the United States to charter and serve as a president of a bank. I'm going to say that again. Miss Walker became the first Black woman in the United States to charter and serve as a president of a bank. That's huge. And the bank was designed to collect small deposits, pennies, and provide loans to Black businesses as it builds its kind of economic base and to promote Black home ownership. Now, early deposits came largely from the members of the Order of St. Luke. And initial bank capital was around like roughly about 9,000. But it serves to include the mortgage lending, and as the bank began to expand, small business loans, and savings and accountability for domestic workers and stuff. And by 1920, the bank had over $400,000 in assets. Now, I wish I would have been able to do a little Google piece and translate what $400,000 in assets mean in today's terms. But if my brother Brass got a quick minute, I want him to do those numbers and we'll talk about it at the end. That means that the bank had thousands of deposits. Okay. And so one of the key things that I want to highlight is that what Miss Maggie Walker did is she designed this model of economic network. She built a cooperative Black economic system around the order. The institutions, again, that she established was the St. Luke Penny and Savings Bank, the St. Luke Imperium, which was a department store, the St. Luke Herald newspaper, and eventually build out these process from this particular order. And so beyond her economic model, this gave her the basis to be able to participate on her civil rights work and her national leaders. So most of us know about Ida B. Wells, but we have to know about Mama Maggie Walker because she was the economic engine and a contemporary of Ida B. Wells, of Mary Church Terrell. And her work as a National Association of Colored Women, she worked alongside of them, but she advocated for anti-lynching legislation. She was part of the Black women's suffrage, which a lot of those women were at the time. And she practiced and taught the value and the principle of economic self-help. And she participated in early Black women's public political mobilization before the 19th Amendment. And she also supported the NAACP in Virginia, including helping with fundraising and organizing some of those work. And so the woman, like Miss Maggie Walker, she established an economic model that could not be compared with at the time. The only person that gets credit, at least in terms of investigating this economic model, was Booker T. Washington. Look at Mama Maggie Walker as the contemporary, if not the early established model of what an economic process will look like in terms of Black cooperative economics and being able to establish multiple institutions within one framework to be able to support the development of our peoplehood and making sure that we're building on our own economic institutions. And so as I pass this, I want to emphasize that it's important to understand that as we develop some of these key things in terms of our history and understanding the models that we use, there's nothing that anybody who comes to America can do that we have not already at least put into practice, expressed the theory of it, been able to make it applicable, and tried it through and through. And so as you unpack and do some Google work of understanding what she did, you'll see how a lot of those things was undermined, how the bank was swallowed up and merged into a bigger bank, and how some of these things became the foundation to how we understand our economic situation. And we'll move forward.
This is where the show takes a turn for me. This is look at it like this. So we discussed William Monroe Trotter. Now that covers civil rights. We discussed Nannie Helen Burroughs. That discussed education. Briggs, this is power. He's the first one where you, as an audience member, and it made me say, I can't believe that there were actually Black people that spoke like that during that time, that they were that radical. He was born in 1888 on the Caribbean island of Nevis in the British West Indies, and he would eventually settle where? Harlem, New York. He became one of the most influential and most controversial Black political thinkers of his era. Now, here's what I mean by hidden architects in our history. Many of the conversations we have when we talk about Black radicalism or Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, and the Black nationalist movements, but you can trace it back to Briggs. We just don't discuss Briggs. What did he build? He founded the African Blood Brotherhood in Harlem, New York. Now, that name sounds a little dramatic, and honestly, it was meant to. The African Blood Brotherhood was one of the first militant Black political organizations in American history. Its goals were simple, and these will sound very familiar, right? Because we discussed the Black Panthers. Now you'll see how I can connect the militants that get pushed to the forefront to Mr. Briggs. Look at the goals: protecting Black communities, fighting racial violence, promoting political organization, encouraging self-defense, building connections between Black people across the world. Now think about the timing. This is 1919. The civil rights movement doesn't exist yet. Malcolm X hasn't even been born yet. The Black Panthers are nearly 50 years in the future, and Briggs was already discussing self-determination, international solidarity, and organized resistance. Now, at the same time, Briggs also founded a newspaper. Yep, he could walk and chew gum at the same time. It was called The Crusader. It was published in Harlem. The Crusader became his platform for discussing race, politics, labor rights, colonialism, Black empowerment, self-defense, whatever you want to call it. And he wasn't just thinking about Mississippi. He wasn't just thinking about New York. He was thinking globally. He believed Black people throughout the world face connected challenges. Now, why did this matter? Because 1919 was one of the most violent years in American race relations. It's often called, what my brother Mujasi mentioned on the first slide, when we talk about the world we inherited. Now we're right at the Red Summer. Black veterans, they returned home from World War I expecting greater respect and equality. Race riots erupted across the country. Many encountered violence and hostility when those veterans came home. Briggs looked at that reality and concluded that Black communities needed organization, strategy, and self-defense. Now, doesn't that sound like the Black Panthers in Oakland? Now, who gets more credit? Everyone that I said. Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, the Black Panthers. But Briggs was helping lay intellectual foundations long before those names even entered the conversation. Once again, Malcolm X wasn't born yet, and the Panthers were 50 years in the future. His quotes: "The race problem is part of a world problem." He was thinking globally, an interconnection. And that sentence tells you almost everything about Briggs. He did not think about thinking small. And the key is he spoke at a time when you weren't supposed to be speaking like this. He saw the future. Before I pass it to my brother Mujasi, Brother Briggs saw the future and built the way to get there. I pass that to my brother Mujasi.
I think that's important to realize that the Black military ideology and application did not start only in the Black Power movement. It was emphasized, it was rekindled. As a matter of fact, it was probably publicized, but we have a rich tradition of organizing around self-determination and Black military movement and thinking about our brotherhood. And I see where Briggs definitely is an anchor in that. And I think that institutional process and building becomes quintessential to this next and last person, the second to the last person that we're going to emphasize. And that's Jane Edna Hunter. Now, if I lived 100 years ago, I would be chasing this woman down, trying to get her to marry me, because she was significant in building one of the most influential institutions to help Black women and Black people as a whole, but particularly Black women, to get established in northern and Midwestern cities. Born in 1882 in Pendleton, South Carolina, her mother, Camilla Hunter, was a formerly enslaved woman who lived around the time of the Civil War, and she was born just right after the Civil War. We don't have any information on who her father was, but she was raised primarily by her mother and her maternal grandmother. Her mother worked as a domestic servant, again, like previous characters that we put up, and reflecting kind of the limited labor opportunities for the Black women in the South. Now, keep that in mind, because that framework and that socialized lens that we understand Ms. Jane from will become the fundamental grounding of what she ended up building later on. She grew up in post-Reconstruction rural environment marked by Jim Crow, segregation, and limited access to formal schooling meant that she developed a strong culture of self-education in her early life. And as a youth leader in her early independence, Hunter worked as a live-in domestic worker for white families, which was common at the time, movie popularized that a little later called The Help. And domestic work was one of the largest employment sectors for Black women in the 1890s. She saved money to pursue education and training outside of the South, and eventually relocated to Charleston, South Carolina, where she worked and saw better opportunities. At least that's what she hoped. And she developed an early interest in social uplift and women's independency. Now, she would later move to Cleveland, Ohio, part of the early wave of Black migration to northern industrial cities. And in the process of doing that, she enrolled in the Cleveland General Hospital for training school for nurses around 1905. And she faced a lot of discrimination during her training. But after she completed her training, she worked as a private nurse for wealthy families. And Cleveland at that time was becoming like a destination city for a lot of Black migrants coming up from the South. So she was able to see a lot of Black folks get off the train, get off their wagons, and try to figure out how they can get situated within the city. But what she identified as one of the key problems with our families migrating up here is that women in the North often experience a social crisis that other women didn't experience. Thousands of young Black women arriving in Cleveland during the Great Migration was facing housing, a struggle with job connections, family networks, and women oftentimes in circumstances like that found themselves vulnerable to a lot of labor exploitation and unsafe housing, and even kind of fell victim to some prostitution networks. And so few social service organizations even existed specifically for Black women migrants who was coming up here. And she believed that an institution building was necessary to address this problem. And so by 1911, Jane Hunter founded the Phyllis Wheatley Association. And okay, so the purpose of the Phyllis Wheatley Association, named after Phyllis Wheatley, a famous literary writer in the 1700s, she provided safe housing for young Black working women, and she offered job placement and life skills training, so a lot of our mothers and grandmothers could come up here and get established and get situated. And the first location was a boarding house for Black women workers, and it offered dormitory rooms, meals, employment guidance. And most of it was also kind of expanding them to help them build some skill sets to be able to court and get into the job market. The organization grew rapidly, it expanded. And some of the services expanded to include housing for migrant women, employment assistance, childcare programs, which most of our mothers and aunties was coming up here with children, and recreation and cultural programming. I get this. This institution and association became the hallmark to establish cultural programmings that allow Black folks to express their artistic, aesthetic, and dignity within their culture. And this was at a time where racially segregated YWCA refused to accept members who were Black or Negro of that time. So by the 1920s, the association has served over thousands of Black women who was coming up here from the South. The building functioned oftentimes as community centers, residence, and employment bureaus. And so during the Great Migration, her work became especially important with Cleveland's Black population when the Cleveland had a huge increase in Black folks coming up here. So during 1915 and 1930, Black folks increased into Cleveland by fivefold, which large numbers of the migrants were young women who either had one or two children. And her organization helped to get them established and get them incorporated into the work life, providing them a place and making sure that the children were safe. She was the executive director of the association for numerous decades, and her leadership style included strict discipline for residents, emphasizing respectability and moral development, and a promotion of education and job training. And some of the institutions developed partners with churches, employers, and Black women, so that way there was a network to helping Black women get established once they became up here. And it became one of the largest Black women's social service institution in the Midwest. And so as I close this out, I think it's important to highlight that Miss Jane Hunter, she stood next to people like Mary McLeod Bethune or Virginia Hope or Jane Addams. And like these were women who were institution builders at that time. And so she's one of those that went beyond just saying, I'm going to be in a space to educate or I'm just going to have to coach or mentor people to get established. She established a Midwestern Northern wide association that allowed Black women coming up from the South to be embraced, to be supported, to find some solace, and to be able to be cared for at a time where oftentimes women were at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder in their migration experience. We'll move to the next one.
Jane Edna Hunter built a place where people could find safety and opportunity. Our next hidden architect tried to do something similar on a national scale. While others were fighting in newspapers, schools, and political organizations, George Edmund Haynes was building systems designed to build millions of people to succeed. Now, this is the beauty of something that I like to say. I like to focus on process, not the result and the outcome all the time. Because if you have a great process, it's replicable, it's duplicatable, then it's something that you can do over and over again. And then at the end, the outcomes will follow if you put in the work, but you have a good process and a good system. Now, George Edmund Haynes was born in 1880 in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, but most Americans have never heard this man's name. But if you ever heard of the National Urban League, you've seen his work. Haynes wasn't a protest leader. He wasn't a famous speaker. He wasn't a newspaper publisher like the people that we've already spoken about. He was something different. He was an institution builder. Now, what did he build? The National Urban League. This is 1910 in New York City. Now, let's stop for a second. When you hear the Urban League, sometimes people don't know what the Urban League actually does or what it did at that time. The Urban League was created to organize protests. It wasn't created to fight court battles. It was created to help people, specifically Black Americans who were leaving the South during the Great Migration. Now, imagine arriving in Chicago. Now, put yourself in their shoes. The glorious Black people that came through the Great Migration. Picture yourself arriving in Chicago or Cleveland or Detroit, one of those Midwestern cities or Eastern cities, Northern cities, and you don't know anybody. You need a job, you need housing, you need information, you need a community. That's where the Urban League stepped in. That organization helped migrants. They found employment, found housing, connect with resources, build economic stability, and in many ways, that support network was the strongest support network behind the Great Migration. Now, why does this matter? Now, it's key because migration is only the first step. You can call it the Great Migration, but it is still only the first step. Moving people does not guarantee success. People need institutions, they need systems, they need opportunities. Abbott helped move people. Haynes helped them survive once they got there. Now, one thing that made Haynes unique was his belief in research. He became one of the first Black sociologists in America. And instead of relying only on speeches, Haynes gathered data. Now, see how that connects to 2026? We're talking about 1910, ladies and gentlemen. He understood the power of data. Data is the thing that runs our entire lives now. He understood this in 1910, the early 1900s. He studied employment, he studied housing, he studied migration patterns, he studied economic conditions, and he believed information could be used to solve problems. Now, I don't like to say the word problems. You'll learn that about me through this, so I'll say challenges, right? His reports help government officials, community leaders, organizations understand what Black Americans were experiencing during one of the most important population shifts in American history. Now, who gets more credit today? Whitney Young, Martin Luther King Jr., Roy Wilkins, later civil rights leaders, other civil rights leaders. But understand that Haynes helped build one of the institutions that those leaders would later inherit. He believed that opportunity, this is his quote, this is from his mouth, these are the words from his soul. He said, opportunity is the foundation of citizenship. In a hidden argument, he turned struggle into structure. Now, why does he still matter? Because Haynes understood something that many people forget. A speech can inspire people. A movement can motivate people. But institutions help people every day. Institutions far outlived the motivation and they far outlived the people who build them. Sound familiar? Martin Luther King. I may not live to see the change that I'm trying to work on. And that's why George Edmund Haynes matters. Now, I got a closing question for George Edmund Haynes before we get into our final wild card. Which changes more lives, a movement that inspires people or an institution that serves people? Because Haynes spent his life betting on institutions. We're going to go right into Mary White Ovington. Now, this is our special architect, our wild card architect. A lot of times, me and Mujasi, we went back and forth, we struggled on whether we should even do it this way, right? Because so far, everyone you've seen are African American or they're from the islands. And we said, man, they're going to kill us for this. But the one thing that we want to be clear on is that movements, systems, and institutions, if you feel like it's just going to be you, you're setting yourself up to fail. We did not get here by ourselves. Would you agree, Mujasi? You want to take 2 seconds on that?
I totally agree. And I think for those of us that won't sleep comfortable at night unless they find a white ally, most of our political movements and progressions in this country has always had white allies, always. And so whether we're incorporating ourselves in the practice of democracy, fighting for social justice, trying to implement anti-lynching campaigns, there were European sympathizers and empathizers who was a part of that tradition with us. And so that's why Mary White Ovington is one of the key people that we're going to elevate during this time. And the work that she did, well, you will see intertwines almost like DNA with some of the significant people that we've highlighted in this point. Can I start it off or do you want to jump in?
Well, no, go ahead. Take it.
Okay, cool. So Miss Mary Ovington was born into an abolitionist family in 1865 in Brooklyn, New York, just days before Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, right? Her parents were abolitionists and supporters of women's rights, and she grew up hearing discussions about slavery and racial justice and social reform. And her family belonged to the Unitarian tradition, which emphasized social activism. If you don't know what Unitarian tradition is, please Google that because it'll give you a framework of some of these whites who was a part of this process. She inherited a belief that racial inequality was a moral problem requiring action. And some of her early career and her early activism was influenced by Frederick Douglass. So as a young woman, she heard Douglass speak in Brooklyn. She read all his material. She got to experience him through small group conversations. And she later described this as a life-changing moment. And unlike many white folks and reformers of her era, she sought direct engagement with Black communities rather than relying on stereotypes and things that she heard from other people. And Douglass helped shape her belief that Black folks should lead their own liberation struggles. And that's important because you'll see this kind of dance in history with our white allies that sometimes they get involved with the movement and they want to thrust themselves in the forefront and be picture poster perfect. She wasn't like that. And that's probably why you haven't heard of her. She worked in New York as a settlement houses serving poor immigrants and working class communities, and she helped establish the Great Greenpoint Settlement in Brooklyn. She later helped organize the Lincoln Settlement House as well, too. She believed that poverty and racial inequality were interconnected. Now, some of us debate about this and make it look like poverty has nothing to do with the racism and white supremacy experience it, but early white allies understood this deep polemic problem that was a part of our experience. And she adopted many of her ideas from Jane Addams and the Hull House. She, rather than relying on, or to mention that piece, she investigated employment discrimination against Black workers, and she studied housing segregation. She interviewed Black workers and families. Her findings became the basis for her influential book, Half a Man, The Status of the Negro in New York. And she argued that white prejudice, not Black inferiority, created unequal outcomes. And she became a close ally of Du Bois during her research. This qualitative experience and practical research that she undertook, this is what got her connected to W.E.B. Du Bois at the time. And she became one of his strongest white supporters. She favored Du Bois' demand for immediate civil rights. She was a part of that camp that rejected Booker T. Washington's more accommodationist approach at that time, but she maintained a lifelong friendship with Du Bois and frequently worked behind the scenes to support his leadership. Now, in 1908, while a white mob attacked Black residents in Springfield, Illinois, the violence shocked many folks in general because Springfield was Lincoln's hometown. Ovington read journalist William English Walling's article calling for a national movement against racial violence, which at the time that would have been a radical position for any white person to do, to call for a national movement against racial violence. Okay, because oftentimes that advocacy came from Negro leadership, and Black intellectual positions. She immediately contacted Walling to get his literature and to bring him involved with that movement. And together with I think it's Henry Moskowitz, they began organizing what became the NAACP. So she was a part of the Niagara movement to be able to establish Black leadership coming involved with that. She was a founding architect of this organization. She helped issue the call for a national conference on Black civil rights in 1909. She recruited activists and scholars and clergy and reformers. She worked alongside Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell, Archibald Gringay, and quite a few other activists who was a part of that class. The National Negro Committee evolved into the NAACP in 1910. And Mary White Ovington became one of the first executive officers who sat on the organizations. And most historians kind of describe her as one of the key organizational founders, but she doesn't get credited along with many others who was a part of that experience. She worked with the NAACP for 40 years. I mean, she had numerous different positions within the organization. I can't even name most of them. And she was a socialist as well, too. Again, socialism was one of the key political ideas and frameworks that challenged democracy and republicanism at that time. And she's used that as a way to support women's voting rights. She joined the Socialist Party. She believed racial justice and economic justice were connected. She wrote for progressive newspapers and journals. She opposed exploitation of workers and criticized child labor sweatshops. And she left an important written legacy, and I'll close with this. My wife has one of her literatures, I believe it was called Half of a Man, what I mentioned earlier, The Status of the Negro in New York. But she wrote material like The Upward Lift, The Upward Path, Portraits in Color, Black and White sat down together, and The Walls Came Tumbling Down, which was kind of like a history of the NAACP. And it's important to highlight a literary establishment and what she left behind because it gives you a glimpse into white radicalism of that time who were empathetic and understood the experience of Black folks in the early 20th century between 1920, 1910, and 1930. And that oftentimes doesn't get elevated in the discourse of history where we try to understand how did white folks, whether we're talking about Jews or just white patrons or allies, what did they think and what was their visceral experience? And Mary White Ovington gives us a really good prism of how radical some of our white allies was at that time. Did I leave anything out, brother Brass? I want to make sure I'm covering because there's some of us who will not sleep well at night unless we highlight some white.
Yeah, I mean, and we know that it's the elephant in the room, right? So
that's right.
I mean, she wasn't a minister, she wasn't Black, she wasn't a newspaper publisher, she wasn't a migration leader, but what she built was long lasting. I mean, and this goes back to the question. This goes back to the question that the only way to abolish injustice is to confront it.
Yeah.
Now, if for me, why she matters, I'm gonna be brief. For me, why she matters is because she reminds us that movements are rarely built by one group alone. That never happens. No matter what you think, it's rarely built by one group alone. They're built by people that are willing to work. They want to work together towards a common goal. Some people stand at the microphone, some people build the stage, but Ovington built part of that stage. Whatever stage that you think that led to the civil rights movement, that led to the things that led us into our future generations that we'll cover when we get into the next 20 years, she built part of that stage. Now, my question, I always leave with a question for the people. and you can put this in the chat. Could the civil rights movement have developed the same way without interracial cooperation?
Wow.
And I know that's a crazy. I know that may seem crazy to some of you, but Mary Ovington is proof that lasting change sometimes requires allies and leaders that don't look like us.
That's right.
And I land my plane right there. I leave that as a thought. You know, I like to leave questions for people to answer in the chat, and then we can continue the conversation there. I want to get right into the roundtable discussion. Now, I challenge you, Mujasi, before the show started.
Mm-hmm.
You can go right into the picture. If you had to save, right?
Whew.
Right? If you had to
Yeah.
save one of these 9 people that we spoke about, to you, who would you save? And I'll give you, you could do one person you'll save and an honorable mention. And then we'll close out.
If there was one person we had to save, oh man.
Yep. Hot seat.
Man, because when you asked me this earlier, I'm like, dude, do I have to
Yeah,
pick
and I
one?
didn't want to know who you had. I didn't want to know. If you had to save, you know, they play this game, I think it's start, bench, cut. Who would you save if you had to pick one?
Yeah.
And then briefly
yeah.
explain why, and then we'll close out.
Okay. I would, man. Ugh. I would save Maggie Walker, and I would give a deep honorable mention to William Monroe Trotter. So Maggie Walker. Okay. I think when I look at some of the movements that we've had in the history, and I look at this pertinence to what our tradition in creating institutions and creating politics and creating economic spaces, how it impacts us today. I think what she attempted to do to introduce a Black cooperative economic model can have one of the most impacting influences of how generations experience life in America today. Okay. And I think every single time I'm in conversations with folks and we're talking about politics and we're talking about social movements and we're talking about our institutions and we're talking about our cultural pride, our psychological health, is somehow we all go back to this: we need economic resources, that our families need financial security, that our institutions need larger macro systems to support their existence. And she was on the path of establishing that. She was in that model. She was educating around that. She established a network within the Independent Order of St. Luke to be able to create this network of funding, banking, newspaper, businesses, and supporting people with their everyday lived lives, just by us galvanizing our pennies into one space. And so we need that to this day. And I'm gonna land there because I could go on and on about that. The honorable mention is because William Trotter, most of us don't understand the courageous and the power of his voice and the and the pride he went into organizing his space within the NAACP and just the larger civil rights movement of that time, because he gets overshadowed by the Booker T's, by the W.E.B. Du Bois, even to some degree Hubert Harrison. But William Monroe Trotter was a radicalist at the time who situated himself within this effort within his class to organize for Black folks' plight across the United States. And so he gets an honorable mention from me because I think he's one of those voices that we have to bring to the public specter and be able to sit him alongside of T. Thomas Fortune and some of these other guys who were significantly important. So that's
going Abbott. I'm going Abbott. I'm going Robert Abbott. And that's why I didn't tell you, because that was your first one. Listen, Abbott did not just report the history.
Yeah.
The Defender was the roadmap. The Defender was the recruitment. The Defender was the guidebook for everybody else, in my opinion, that we spoke about.
Yes.
When Abbott is the one that told them where to go. When we actually pick these leaders for the shows, if you remember and you go backwards, I was saying, man, I wish that I could have got Abbott because
Yeah.
I knew with the
Yeah.
defender what it was. You can always change the politics and this, that, and the other, but without Abbott, Harlem looks different.
Yes.
Chicago looks different. That political
Yep.
power, it develops differently, right?
Mhm.
After we get here.
Mhm.
So he didn't just build one institution. He created the environment so you can build a whole bunch of institutions, right?
Come on.
So when you look
Yes.
at the Defender as more than a newspaper and look at it more as a roadmap, like I said, a landing place, it hurt because I wanted to pick Trotter, right? And I wanted to pick others. If my honorable mention would be Ovington, right? I'm glad she was the wild card because I don't think any of this, I don't think what we have today in 2026 exists without the NAACP. And she was so integral in the founding of the NAACP and its early works. I mean, picture life without Brown v. Board of Education. So at the end of the day, I'm going to go Abbott because Abbott, I just think this whole thing looks different. And now this is not to take away from anybody, but I feel like in closing, if I save Abbott, I save the movement of the people. If I save Ovington, I save the institutions that protected the people, right?
Yes.
So Abbott moved the people, Ovington helped organize the fight. But if I had to pick one, I'm going to pick Abbott. Now in closing, right? This was fun, right? This is the beginning, right? We're doing 1910 to 1930. Our next will be 1930 to 1950.
1950.
So now you'll see how we laid the groundwork and we laid the seeds. Now, next time we may bring some other people. This is TMI, Tri-Media Innovations, but that we have other people on board. We want to give information, right? And it doesn't have to, this is not teaching. We're sharing you the passion. We're sharing with you the feeling that we have, because at the end of the day, we know when you go and look at the guy that runs for 2,000 yards on a football team, rarely does the line get it. Rarely does the assistant coach get it. And we didn't get here by ourselves. And what this is in closing, this is the blueprint for us in 2026 to get to where we want to today. We are not going to get here by ourselves. We're not going to get wherever we want to go by ourselves. It's going to be the hidden leaders, not the loud voices. You know, in critique, sometimes I feel like, and I shared this with my brother Mujasi before, that we're just looking for perfect leaders and the next Martin Luther King Jr. And because we haven't found it, our group as a whole has not moved. But I truly believe that we got enough of these kind of hidden architects to build the future of tomorrow that we need to take care of the children of tomorrow and get us to where we have to be. This is Tri-Media Innovations. I appreciate the executive producing of my brother, The Truest, and my brother Hits. We're signing off. We'll see you in 1930. Peace out.